lately I've been browsing, treading water that they drowning. My head on a swivel, yeah. It's only really my surroundings.
Hello and welcome to episode 62 of the Smash Cassette podcast. I'm your host, Michael Royer. You can find me on Twitter at Dynasty_DadFF. Apologize for last week. You know, I got cut by my former team to see if I was clearing waivers. Now I'm back in free agency, just like Odell Beckham, which I'm sure we'll talk about here. Mung, I'm excited. You know, we had a week off there. I'm excited to talk it because Week 9 was just crazy, right? I mean, every single week this year has just seemed crazier than the week before. You know, I'm sitting here, it's 3:00 games. I'm feeling pretty good about most of my teams, and you know as well as I do that I own Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins in almost every league. And now it's like, oh, let's scramble and try to figure things out. I mean, seems like every week just gets crazier and crazier.
Yeah, what's up, guys? You guys can find me, of course, on Twitter at FFA_Mung. That's MENG. And it's pretty nuts to think that we've just reached the halfway point of this season because it feels like, you know, with many years that we've already kind of played through 2 or 3 seasons in just 9 weeks, right? We remembered early on when Derrick Henry was just dominating, and now he's out for the rest of the year. We remember when Jonathan Taylor seemingly had a very slow start, and now he's dominating. So just a lot of players' stocks moving vastly up and vastly down in just a couple short weeks, really.
And Derrick Henry is still the RB1 in points overall, which is absolutely crazy, you know, after missing a few. And that's why we wanted to talk tonight about teams that are, you know, we're going into Week 10 now, right? We got to figure out, at this point, you know if you're in it, right? You know if you're a contender or not. But this is the time of year where we start to look at things and, like, got to determine if, you know, am I rebuilding? Am I retooling? And so those are some of the trades we're going to talk about next week, is really kind of do that. But today we want to really hammer home the contenders, the guys that have that soft schedule that you haven't quite been looking at, guys that, you know, are coming back from IR that are, you know, there's some guys like Chris Carson and David Montgomery that are really, you know, poised to make a big splash here in the second half of the season. And I'm just excited to try to add some of these. You know, there's some guys that you and I started texting each other, and I'm like, I'm going to make moves for those guys, you know, and I was able to pick a couple of them up here. So we wanted to give you some ideas of what those trades look like, some of those guys you should be picking up. But before we do that, Mung, like on your contenders, you know, right now you're 7-2, 6-3, even 5-4 with some downward luck here. What are you really trying to do, you know, on those contending teams? Because I feel like this year and last year, we got to look at it a little bit differently. Like 2-3 years ago, this is where I'd be doing a 2-for-1, maybe even a 3-for-1, and really trying to get that one piece to lock down the title. But how do you look at your rosters? And is COVID and the string of injuries we've had, is that scaring you off a little bit?
Not really, to be honest with you, because you guys know that I'm all about minimizing risk in Dynasty, right? Because long term, there's so much variance that can happen, whether it's injuries, whether it's surprise retirements like Andrew Luck and Calvin Johnson. We know that injuries can happen. Just look at the slew of running back injuries, the ETN, Akers, etc., before the start of this season. But when you're in the middle of the season, that's when you got to push your chips all in, right? Because we know that it's still risky at this point, Week 9, you know, 6 weeks away from the fantasy playoffs, right? But at this point, other teams are also starting to figure out whether they're going for the title or potentially kicking off a rebuild. So depending on the league, of course, you know, there should be quite a flurry of trade activity before that Week 13, 14 trade deadline in a lot of leagues. So really at this point, yes, you don't want to necessarily mortgage your entire future to go all in, but you need to start making some moves, because if you don't put out some trade offers soon, there's also the possibility that other contending teams could beat you to the punch for some players that you want to add to your squad to go for a title run.
Yeah, and tonight we're not going to talk a lot about those big names. You know, we talked about that 2 weeks ago where I was saying, hey, I'm going out and I'm buying Christian McCaffrey. And in UDPL2, I was able to do that for James Robinson, Devonta Smith, and a late 23 first. And Robinson was my RB4. Devonta Smith was my wide receiver 6. You know, so those are some of those moves where it's like, I feel like I'm going all in, and that's a guy that can bring that home. You know, and I feel like McCaffrey looked the part. He came back this past week, saw 14 carries. And he didn't get into the end zone, but he was involved. In the first half, we're not really involved in the passing game, but in the second half, completely involved there. Chuba was mixed in a little bit, but it looks like Christian McCaffrey is back and a guy that's definitely poised to lead you guys into the promised land. I think he's still at a value, right? I mean, we talked a couple weeks back about our top 5 running backs, and McCaffrey versus Jonathan Taylor. I saw a Twitter poll out today. It's 80-20 now, and I'm firmly in that camp now. I was McCaffrey 2 weeks ago, but Taylor just keeps coming out every single week. But McCaffrey's available here, and that buy window seems to be closing up, right? So if you see that he's on a team that's 4-5 or even 3-6, I think now's the time to make an aggressive move after Christian McCaffrey, because he's the kind of guy that could easily win you a championship.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's just McCaffrey being undervalued a little bit because of his recent injury issues, or Jonathan Taylor being overvalued because of his slew of amazing games over the last few weeks. But I think if I'm recalling correctly, somebody asked me about Jonathan Taylor for Christian McCaffrey in a first, and I told them to accept that for a contending team.
Getting McCaffrey and the first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow, yeah.
So obviously, I don't think that's a deal you can get done in a ton of leagues, but they're out there, so it's time to test the waters. Because again, in season is when a lot of dynasty values are in flux. So you just never know whether your league mates are super down on a player based on really really bad performances the last few weeks, or really high on a player that you could potentially sell high on because of the recent production.
Yeah, recency bias is huge there. I mean, I would say it should be a lot closer to 50-50, 60-40 with the Jonathan Taylor versus Christian McCaffrey hype. But, I mean, Jonathan Taylor since week 4 has gone out there and put up 20, 31, 28, 18, 21, 34. And just this past week coming off, 19 for 172 and 2. So, I mean, Jonathan Taylor is an absolute beast, and we're not advocating selling low. But if you can get Christian McCaffrey and a first, we talk about insulated values. Usually we go the other way, right? We try to sell the older player. But if you're getting a guy like Christian McCaffrey on a contender, I think you got to do that.
And think about, players like DJ Moore or Mike Williams, right? How many firsts in value have they lost over the last 3 weeks? People were talking about DJ Moore as a top 3 dynasty wide receiver early on in the season. They were talking about Mike Williams being a world beater. And for the record, I like both still long term, but just their value has changed very drastically over the last 3 or 4 weeks.
Well, and I think, especially in the Twitter community, I mean, the value of a player isn't what it used to, right? It's not like the guy we'll give him some patience. I mean, I find that I'm seeing owners in a lot of our leagues where they're trying to trade based off of, sometimes we talk about it all the time. It's a stock. It is a player's value is a stock, not a player, but a player's value is a stock. And sometimes you got to hold those stocks, right? You got to hold those stocks before they take off. And we just get so excited and so enamored and want to win. We see that guy who had 3 big weeks, and we're like, well, let's move on here. So let's talk about the running backs positions first. I talked about McCaffrey, another guy coming back from injury. That I was advocating plugging in his lineup. A lot of people were saying, well, there's been Khalil Herbert has been really good. And we're going to see maybe it's a 50-50 split. That was not the case. Montgomery was on the field 74% of the snaps, and the way Justin Fields played, in back-to-back games now, Montgomery's going to get some real opportunities here in the second half of the season. And I'm seeing people selling him for, late firsts in Superflex. I'm seeing him sold for 2 seconds and a lesser running back. I think David Montgomery proved last year that he has the chops to definitely take you where you're looking to go.
Yeah, I think a lot of the concerns were alleviated last night against Pittsburgh. A very good defense in his first game back, no less. And he looked every bit like his old self, showed that burst. And, to your point, I was someone who was concerned about Khalil Herbert maybe eating into a little bit of his work, but that just doesn't seem like it's going to be the case based on last night. So certainly feel more confident in him going forward.
Yeah, and Khalil Herbert and Chuba Hubbard, I mean, I want to talk about this a little bit, is, those guys come back, and I feel like the Twitter community and a lot of people just write them off completely, right? Khalil Herbert, what he did in David Montgomery's absence, was fantastic. I mean, he went out there and he put up, 10 to 15 fantasy points each week. And when that guy comes back and now all of a sudden there's that Khalil Herbert owner, you could probably get him added into a deal. Those are sometimes we talk about the shiny new toy, the guy that's out there playing, but you might be able to go out there and get Chuba. You might be able to go out there and get, Khalil Herbert thrown into deals. And the way guys are going down, the way the running back position has been with things with COVID, they could be players where they prove that they could be solid RB2s on your team down that stretch run. And I think that's something where a lot of these different situations, I'm trying to buy some backup running backs. I'm trying to get some guys added into deals where if I'm trying to make a trade and it's close, hey, add in Khalil Herbert and you got a deal. And I don't feel like most people are going to argue with that at this stage in the game, but that could give you a guy down the stretch, week 15, 16, 17, if Montgomery goes down again, you got a solid RB2 in hand.
Yeah, that's a great point because in a couple leagues where I lost Christian McCaffrey, I went out and I made deals for Darrell Henderson and James Conner, not Chuba Hubbard, because at that point in time, the Chuba Hubbard dynasty team has all the leverage in the world, right? Now with McCaffrey coming back, this is when I just sent out 2 trade offers for Chuba Hubbard because now he's pretty much worthless to that team until he'll be forgotten in short time, and that's when you kind of try and buy that dip.
Yeah, and that's buy low, sell high, right? 2 of the guys you talked about there are 2 other guys that we have on the list. Let's talk first about James Conner. James Conner, I talked about some of these powerhouse teams where I have Saquon and Kamara and Zeke, and I threw out there Connor this week because it was like I had DeAndre Hopkins and he was in my flex spot, and I'm like, oh man, I need someone. I was like, I'll throw James Conner in there. Let's see what he does. James Conner goes out and goes nuts, right? I mean, he had an amazing game. After his 42 points he put up this week, he's the RB10 right now, and he has been rock solid, and he's a great piece in that lineup that we want parts of that Arizona lineup, right? And James Conner looked great. Now he gets a 3 to 4 game stretch here where it's just him and Eno Benjamin because obviously Edmonds is out with a high ankle sprain at least 3 to 4 weeks now.
Yeah, and look, Connor's another guy who we know that his value is in the short term, but that doesn't matter when we're in the midst of the season, right? Because right now, again, is when you are willing to pay a second, a third for some of these players to just get you through the next 3 or 4 weeks, right? If you had Christian McCaffrey on the IR, if you had Saquon Barkley on the IR, if you made a move for someone like Connor or someone like that to just get you through the last 2-3 weeks and you got 2 wins out of that, then that was worth that rookie pick if it gets you to the fantasy playoffs and ultimately, a top 2, top 3 finish.
Absolutely. And the Twitter poll that I just pulled up on my fantasy league has James Conner or a late super flex second round pick, and it's 60-40. I mean, that blows my mind. It's got to be, I'm not selling for that. If a contender comes calling and they're like, obviously I always try to negotiate getting a first one way or another, right? Yeah, that's a late first. I'll throw in a third. Hey, that's a late first, and I'll throw in, a upside wide receiver that might not pan out into anything. I mean, I think James Conner, anything, cheaper than a mid superflex second, I think is an absolute smash accept. I mean, if you can go out there and get him for that, I'm all for that, and I think there's the more depth you have at that running back position, if you can get him for any second round pick, I'm not quite comfortable playing a late first. That's not where I'm at yet because I don't think James Conner's longevity is there, but it's borderline there, right?
Yeah, it depends, and it's good timing for this show because I actually got an offer from a contending team of their 2022 second in a Superflex format for my James Conner in a league this morning, and I accepted that. Yeah. Because one, it's tough to project the exact finishes, but I didn't think they were a top 2, top 3 seed. But even for a late second in Superflex, the problem with Conner is that certain players I feel like just don't hold a ton of trade value, even when something like this happens. So I did not think that I could get 2 seconds for him. I could have pushed for the second plus the third, but I was happy with the second. And again, it depends on, gauging the GMs in your league, gauging how willing people are to trade for him. And then also, I do think that Conner is a little bit of a sell high because we're not expecting another 40-point outing from him, even though he's going to be the lead back for Arizona for the next 3 or 4 weeks, right? We expect
Yeah.
a touchdown dependent RB2 production because at the same time, they face Carolina this week, who's tough on the run. And then they face Seattle, who's been good at the run.
Right.
And then after that, Chase Edmonds may be back. So, yes, I do think he's a good fill in for contending teams who need an RB2 spot for the next few weeks. But at the same time, don't expect that kind of production from him. So it's really a gray area for all these buys and sells.
Well, and with Colt McCoy starting this week, I mean, if you look at the last several weeks, you look at James Conner, he put up 10 points, 10 carries, 29 yards. Luckily, he saved out with a touchdown. The week after that, 16 carries for 71, no touchdowns. That gets you 8 points. Then it was 10 for 64 and a touchdown, 5 for 22, but he saved it with 2 touchdowns. You're right. He's in that offense where you want him to be. He has produced the touchdowns, but he's been very touchdown dependent. Luckily, he's been putting up, he has 4 2-touchdown games this year, and no one else has that. And that's what's kind of propelled his status. And I think, in those type of situations, you definitely want him. And that's why we're talking about for contenders. This is the type of player you want. This is the guy that's going to be there. The question that I have sometimes is people are saying, hey, I'm 4-5 and James Conner's my RB2. What do I do? And that's the tricky part, right? Because if you're 4-5 and James Conner's your RB2, you're in a sticky situation here where maybe it's time we got to evaluate that, right? Do we trade James Conner to someone that's up there and maybe trade James Conner for like an early second and Khalil Herbert or Chuba Hubbard or one of these other guys or even Chase Edmonds? I've seen people do those kind of moves where, when Etienne went out, I traded Etienne for James Robinson and flip-flopped to first and second. So try to get that production, try to stay in that same realm. And Carson, we're going to talk about next. But Connor's a guy that, he could be a sell high. He could be a buy low. It's really dependent on your league. And I feel like it's at least worth exploring, and trying to see what kind of value you can get there. The other guy I wanted to talk about is Chris Carson. Chris Carson just is coming off IR this week. He's been injured a lot, and he's been banged up. But when on the field, he is a fringe RB1. He's always at least an RB2. The 3 games that he's played this year, he's put up 12, 15, 16 points. So what are we doing with Chris Carson right now? I feel like if you're a contender, I don't think he's worth a first. Last year was the guy where I was like, go buy him for a first, right? He's still there. Would you rather have Carson or Connor? And second, what kind of value are we looking at for Chris Carson?
Yeah, personally, I'm staying far, far away from Chris Carson. The PTs that I follow on Twitter, that I read, Gene Bramall over at Football Guys, Edwin Poyas over at Fantasy Points, guys like this, they're talking about his, cervical neck issue where it's very risky, right? This could be a potential season ender, career ender. We just don't know. And then on top of that, even if he does practice on Wednesday, as the Seahawks are supposedly saying, and activated from IR this week or next, is he going to go back to the role that he had before? Are we going to see more Alex Collins and DJ Dallas and Travis Homer mixed in there because they're concerned about his longevity? So again, this is just a risky bet where depending on the price, maybe I take a stab at him. But, honestly, if I'm paying a late second, I'd rather take a shot on Connor at this point because I know that he's going to play the next couple of weeks. And no, I don't think that he's going to put up RB1 production that Carson potentially could if he's fully healthy and goes back to that role, but I don't trust that.
I gotcha. No, I'm okay with that. The one guy you and I both seem to be in complete agreement here, a guy that you go out and buy, is Darrell Henderson, right? I mean, Darrell Henderson gets week 15, 16, 17. He's got all top 10 matchups in the run game. He has looked fantastic. He's had multiple games. He has 5 games over 17 points. They are an offense that's just, again, kind of like Connor. That Rams offense just is clicking. I know this past week was a little rough, but for the season long, they have been clicking, and he's a guy that I'm firmly going out there and buying, and I would be willing to pay more than either of the last 2 guys that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and this is where, try not to be stingy for contending teams, right? I mean, don't get taken for great overpays, but At the same time, I'd rather pay a first plus a second for Daryl Henderson than a second for Chris Carson or James Conner right now. Like, I want that reliable production. I want that workhorse role. And obviously, if you can get Sony Michelle too as the handcuff. But some of these deals that I've seen for Daryl Henderson are just straight up steals, right? I've seen a bunch where it's just a 2021st, presumably late, straight up for Henderson. I've seen a 2021st plus a sweetener like David Johnson or Mike Davis, which are easy throw ins. I've seen Travis Etienne straight up, where Etienne's not doing anything for you this year. So if you're contending, that's a gamble that I'm willing to take, even though I know that this is a rental for the next 7-8 weeks.
Yeah, and I mean, you got me onto this, and I sold my last Cam Akers share. We talked about this where Henderson has looked so good that Akers. There's a lot of positive things out there. That the fact that he wasn't on the IR now, that he's on the what is it, PMP or DNP list, where he could possibly come back for the playoffs or anything like that. But I sold Cam Akers, and I think you'll be proud of me here. I sold Cam Akers, Gabe Davis, and Robert Tonyan in a heavy tight end premium for Kittle this week, and I was thrilled because Kittle came back with a fury, right? And he looked amazing. But I mean, back to Henderson, he gets week 15, 16, and 17 in the playoffs. Seattle, third worst against the run. Minnesota, 10th. Baltimore, 9th. And those are some games that are potential shootouts where multiple touchdowns could be involved there, and he could be a league winner given those opportunities where he's going to put up 15 to 20 points in high shootout situations against teams that struggle against the run. So if you guys can go out there and get Henderson, more power to you.
And real quick, I will say that those teams aren't actually bad against the run. They're actually outside of Minnesota, Seattle and Baltimore are pretty good at allowing or at not allowing many rushing yards to running backs. Mm-hmm. But it's touchdowns in the red zone. Right. They can't seem to stop them because Seattle's given up 7 touchdowns to running backs in 8 games. The Vikings have given up 8 touchdowns to running backs in 8 games. And Baltimore, who allows very few rushing yards overall, actually has given up 9 touchdowns to running backs in 8 games. So this is really where we know that the Rams do like to run in the red zone. They've eased up off of that a little bit after upgrading Stafford, but still, this fantasy playoff schedule is very friendly for Henderson.
Absolutely. Let's switch it over here, kind of staying in the same position, but we don't really look at him quite like a running back. You have to buy Cordarrelle Patterson now, right? I mean, I went out and I bought him in 2 separate leagues. I gave up, I believe it was a second, a third in Robert Tonyan for Cordarrelle Patterson. And I mean, the production that he's putting up, and in depending which league you're in, I think all sleeper leagues have him as wide receiver / running back, so you can have him in either. That versatility is huge for the playoffs. My fantasy league, it just depends on your commissioner. Some of them I have him as running back, some of them he's wide receiver, some of them he's a flex. You can do either way, but he's not going away. Like we wanted Mike Davis to be a thing, but you look at 23, 16, 34, 18, 14, 18, 19. I mean, this past week was 9 carries for 10 yards, but he had 6 receptions for 120. So like Cordarrelle Patterson is a weapon, and I feel like if you have a shot to get him, go out and do it because, yeah, I mean, at some point he might turn back into a pumpkin, right? But for right now, we have to believe what we've seen through these first 9 weeks. And they had their bye week in there, but you have to believe Cordarrelle Patterson is a guy who's not going to go away. I personally just made another trade. I've been super active the last couple of days on trades, but I know you and I were talking about this one a little bit. I gave up Godwin and Bateman, but I got Tyreek Hill and Cordarrelle Patterson for a stretch run there, and I feel like that puts me in a position where I still have a little bit of, and that one he's in as a running back, so I have a little bit of flexibility there where I got a wide receiver and a running back. I love Bateman, I love Godwin, but Tyreek Hill, we talk about him a lot and gush on what he's doing if the Chiefs can bounce back. But I know I went all over the place, went full circle, but Cordarrelle Patterson, it just seems like a no-brainer.
I really don't know what's stopping people from going out and getting him. We've always known that the talent's there, right? I mean, we've been talking for years how he's been miscast as a wide receiver when really he does very well out of the backfield.
Yeah.
And finally, we're seeing Arthur Smith use him correctly. PPR RB7 on the year, RB6 in points per game.
Insane.
Since Atlanta's bye, he's averaging a 63% snap share, so his usage has gone up for those who are, talking about the touchdown dependency. And on the year, Patterson is third in targets if we're looking at him as a running back, behind only DeAndre Swift and Najee Harris. If you're
Absurd.
concerned about the touchdown regression, Patterson's fourth in red zone target share, behind only Harris and Swift and Alvin Kamara. So clearly one of Brian's go-to red zone targets. So I don't see why the touchdowns wouldn't keep coming at a fair rate, even if they regress a little bit. And when you look at him against another name that people are very, very high on in Dynasty, right? Cordero Patterson versus DeAndre Swift. 4.8 receptions per game to Swift's 5.9 receptions per game. 92 yards from scrimmage for Patterson versus 88 per game for Swift. 7 total touchdowns for Patterson thus far versus 5 for Swift. And Patterson's scoring 19.2 PPR points per game versus 18.2 for DeAndre Swift. So don't think about buying Cordero Patterson as, oh, I'm getting 8 games out of this guy, and I paid a second and a third, something like that for him. Think about it like you're renting DeAndre Swift for the next 8 games for a second-round rookie pick. Like that, you can't do that because of collusion, but this is essentially what you're doing if you're paying for Cordero Patterson, right? Yeah. Think about it in those terms.
I love that, because DeAndre Swift's going to cost you 3 firsts now, at minimum. I feel like that's where you're at, and you're buying the production. If you take the names out of it, the production that Cordero Patterson has given, I'm not advocating going out there and giving up, something that could be a mid-first or anything like that. But the production that he's been putting up is undeniable, and he's definitely, most owners that have him, and I have him in almost all my leagues now, they got him for free, right? And they're like, oh, I'm making some value. I'm just gonna push this because I feel like it's not gonna sustain. And if it's lasted this long, it's looked this good. He's just available out there. Go get him. Go get Cordero Patterson. Thank us later.
He's not even that expensive. I mean, again, looking at just trades from November, the last couple of weeks, a lot of people are getting him straight up for a 2022 second, right? Michael Gallup for Patterson and Tyler Conklin. Jacoby Myers straight up. Odell Beckham straight up. These are trades that have happened, and that's an easy smash accept to get Patterson if you're contending right now.
100% there. Going to talk real quick here about, the Broncos went out and they just embarrassed Dallas this past weekend. But what I want to talk about is the upcoming schedule for these guys. Whether it's Javonte Williams, the schedule that these guys have. Melvin Gordon's been carrying, a good share of that. If Melvin Gordon goes down, Javonte Williams' stock is going to go through the roof, because if you look what he has coming up, he's got Philly, their 4th most friendly. Then they got the bye, you got the Chargers, everything the whole way down. This looks like Jonathan Taylor's schedule from last year. It is 8 straight games in the green of bottom 10 run defenses. And then when you get into the fantasy playoffs, you're looking at this exact same thing. Javonte Williams, if he's still available, if you could still buy him on the cheap, I'm saying, Melvin Gordon's still worth it to go out there and get him because the points are going to be there. But I'm telling you, this kid, if the injury occurs, Javonte Williams could see an absolutely massive increase in value here and production down the stretch. And, in my home league, someone just dropped him. They were like, before this week, they're like, I couldn't decide between him and Tony Pollard, and they dropped Javonte Williams, and I'm all in there. I'm going after him with my fab because this is a juicy, juicy schedule down the stretch.
Yeah, and look, I'm all for buying Javonte Williams because from what we've seen, I wasn't as high on him as others were in the preseason, but based on what we've seen from him, I've come around. But at the same time, I hear this narrative a lot, right? What if Melvin Gordon misses time? Yeah. What if Javonte Williams misses time? Melvin Gordon's the PPR.
He's the cheaper version.
15.
Yeah.
And he gets no respect for a 3rd round rookie pick in some leagues preseason. You can still get Gordon for a second. A lot of the deals that we just discussed for Cordero Patterson, you can certainly get Melvin Gordon for those prices. And I mean, if you need a plug and play RB2, why not again go for the cheaper guy? We talked about Cordero Patterson versus DeAndre Swift, and Melvin Gordon is still out carrying and out producing Javonte Williams, and we've seen nothing from the Broncos to indicate that that's going to change rest of the season.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You know, and we're trying to cover both areas there. You know, like if you're all in, you could probably get Melvin Gordon for a second. You know, and I think that's a great buy there, and that's a great narrative to put that way. You know, you can go either direction. Another guy that you could have bought for a third round pick in the offseason, but now, you know, is a top 10 running back is Leonard Fournette. I mean, Leonard Fournette right now is another guy that I feel like you've got to go out there and buy. I mean, he's had some monster weeks. You know, he hit 21, 30, 17. I mean, he's been really, really putting up those points, which, you know, we're going to talk about Brady here soon, which is mandatory when we're talking about, you know, buy low veterans and things like that. But Leonard Fournette has to be a guy in that same kind of area where if you got a second sitting around, go out there and make an offer for Leonard Fournette.
Yeah, I'm just a little hesitant on him because I don't know how much they run when they have Antonio Brown and Rob Gronkowski healthy for the stretch run late in the season. And then also just because he does get the Saints again in the first week of the fantasy playoffs in week 15. Another tough run defense against Carolina in 16. So I think just looking at the schedule, the fantasy playoffs aren't quite as good for him, but definitely the upcoming schedule is phenomenal to get you there.
Well, let's stick with that. Let's stick with that team here. I mean, you know, they got New Orleans, which seems to have during the regular season they have Tom Brady's number, you know. But once we get to I saw a thing, it was like New Orleans, Eli Manning, and Nick Foles are the only people that have Tom Brady's number, and that's kind of accurate. But they get Carolina, and then they get the Jets. They get the Jets week 17. The Jets are the friendliest to the wide receivers. They're the friendliest, not to the quarterbacks, but I mean, like, we have a situation here where Tom Brady has been putting up monster numbers again. I mean, if you're in a 6-point passing touchdowns, he's almost a lock for 35 points every single week. I mean, and that's putting you in a crazy situation where see who owns Tom Brady. You know, still go out there and make that offer, even if you got to go, you know, trade one of your guys back and get a little bit. It's an exciting round, an area to get Tom Brady, to get Mike Evans, to get Antonio Brown, to get Chris Godwin, because they do have a pretty nice schedule down the road here.
We have to talk about Tom Brady. I mean,
I know you don't like that. I know it's. You slipped me a 5 before we even started this. You're like, let's talk about Brady a little bit.
Look, last year before the 2020 season, do you know what my heaviest bet was?
Before the Tom Brady MVP.
That and the Bucks to win the Super Bowl. And that was, again, my favorite bet this preseason. Brady to win the MVP at plus 1,400. You know, I've probably talked about this on 4 or 5 of our shows earlier this year, but the man is on pace for 5,600 yards and 53 passing touchdowns. And I don't feel like anyone's talking about this.
No, he's the QB1, and everybody's talking about Lamar. Everybody's talking about what Stafford's doing. And I mean, they're having great seasons in their own right, but he's still the QB1.
Yeah, and you talk about the Saints shutting down the Bucks. A lot of that was turnovers. Brady still threw for close to 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. I mean, 2 picks, one of them awful to seal the game, but at the same time, fantasy-wise, he had a great day, right? There was no issues there. And again, this is where people have been talking about the age problem for years, right? The impending demise, and we just have yet to see it. Look, I understand that you can get younger quarterbacks in your leagues, but I'd rather pay a first or a first plus a second for a 44-year-old Brady if I'm contending right now, right? He might get Gronk back this week. It sounds like Antonio Brown is still a couple weeks out. But at this point in time, there's no quarterback with a safer floor and higher ceiling rest of season. I see no reason why he cannot finish as the number 1 fantasy quarterback for this season. And even in one quarterback, I think I'd be close to paying, you know, a late first, early second if that gets me a title.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm looking at it where I just made a deal where I gave up 3 firsts and Teddy Bridgewater to get Lamar Jackson and David Montgomery because I was like, yo, Lamar's at that ceiling. I mean, Lamar's ceiling this year, he has been rock solid, right? He's been phenomenal. But if you can buy Tom Brady for 1, that's a totally different game, right? You cannot buy Josh Allen most of the time. and that was in a 14-team league. You can't buy Mahomes. Well, maybe there's a little bit window there, but Lamar, and Mahomes and Josh Allen, those guys, Justin Herbert, Kyler Murray, you can't get them. It's not happening. And, you're going to have to pay an arm and a leg. Go out there and get Brady. Send us some offers. I want to see what you guys are able to get Tom Brady for. Last year, I bought him in my 10-team, 2-quarterback league. Someone's like, hey, I'm out of it. Just give me a first. Guess what? That was supposed to be a rebuilding team for me, but I was like, I'm going to give up that first because I think Brady with the Bucs is going to be something that's special. I won the championship, and I'm undefeated this year. It's like being able to get Tom Brady. No one says that he's not playing next year or the next year. It's like I get his age, but this is nothing we've ever seen before. It was probably 4 years ago where you could buy Tom Brady for a super flex first, right? Because you're like, he's getting up there in age. If you did that 4 years ago, think about all the production you got for that first round pick. It's insane.
Yeah, and even now, when he's the number one scoring fantasy quarterback, even after a bye week, right? You're still seeing deals in November over the last couple of weeks. Baker Mayfield straight up, Mac Jones straight up. I saw a couple where it was Terrace Marshall and a second for Brady in Superflex. These are all Superflex deals, not one quarterback. Yeah. Somebody gave them up for Darnell Mooney straight up. And at this point, you'll probably need to pay a first or even a first plus a second in a lot of Superflex leagues. But these deals are still out there depending on, your league.
One of my favorites was in draft. And we talk about being able to navigate in draft. The guy above me wanted behind me, I had the 107, he had the 108. He really wanted Devonta Smith. And I knew Waddle was still there, and I was debating between the two, and I was like, hey, he goes, yeah, I'm rebuilding a little bit. He's like, I'll give you Brady to move up one spot. I was like, all right, no problem. So I ended up getting Waddle and Brady. It's a 1-quarterback league, so it's not too much to write home about. But it's like sometimes you can navigate and get those vets. Sometimes teams that are, you never know until you go out there and check where they're not in contention. You can buy these players on the cheap, And there's other quarterbacks definitely to target in there. The one guy I wanted to talk about, and I know he's got a juicy schedule down the end with in the fantasy playoffs. Jalen Hurts gets to play Washington twice, but this offense is not the same, right? This is not the same offense where Jalen Hurts was putting up 30 fantasy points a game. They are running nonstop. And I keep getting questions about Jordan Howard. Jordan Howard basically comes out and he goes back-to-back over 15 points. He's getting the touchdowns. Are we at a spot where we should consider selling high on Jalen Hurts based on what's going here? I know, there's a lot of people in the community that have been up and down. His value kind of all over the place.
Yeah, it's tough because I just don't know that after these last 2 weeks, his value has dipped a little bit. If you were asking me, do you want to sell high after some of those huge garbage time games, then yeah, for sure. Yeah. But, we know the risk is there. There have been rumors that maybe they'll check out Gardner Minshew late in the season if things aren't going well. I don't know that it'll get to that point, but to your point, they have been running the ball more. Jordan Howard is definitely a sell high if you can get anything for him. But Jalen Hurts is probably a hold for me. It's very price dependent. But if you're contending, I think the rushing floor is still there for him because the Eagles' defense is still not playing great. So there will be catch-up game scripts for him going forward. But again, in the fantasy playoffs against Washington twice, maybe not. So Depends on what kind of quarterback you're pivoting from. If you're contending and selling Jalen Hurts, if you can get Tom Brady plus, then yeah, I'd consider that.
That is the exact trade I was. You'll be seeing it soon. I'm trying to negotiate something there where it was I'm trying to get Tom Brady and a first for Jalen Hurts. In a game in a league where I think I can win. It's I can do that. And it doesn't feel quite as risky. The great point there, and it was wow, Washington is the friendliest when it comes to giving up points to the quarterbacks. And I saw he plays week 15 and 17. On the flip side, let's talk about, I want to talk quickly about, we'll get to wide receivers, but talk about tight ends. Logan Thomas is coming off IR. The Eagles are the friendliest when it comes to the tight end position. They are getting absolutely torched this year. 15 and 17, Logan Thomas is a guy that people forgot about, but He's been a tight end 1. Last year he was, I believe, the tight end 6. This year he was starting out in that same kind of area. I think Logan Thomas, people have forgotten about him because of IR. And I think he's a guy that you could definitely go out there and buy on the cheap. Some other guys, you and I have talked about is Tyler Conklin. He has had some opportunities where he's really come out. And Zach Ertz is we knew if he got into the right offense, he was going to be electric, and he's there in Arizona. We talked about wanting Connor to be part of that offense. Zach Ertz now is in that tight end 1 category as well. And I think these guys can be had on the cheap end that could really fill in. I mean, you're not going to be able to buy Waller. You're not going to be able to buy Kittle. You're not going to be able to buy, Hawkinson windows closed. You're not going to be able to buy Kelsey very cheap. But these are some guys that you could really throw in there.
Yeah, and you mentioned Logan Thomas, and before he got hurt, he was the number 6 tight end in PPR. He was outscoring Kittle, Knox, and Andrews over the first 3 weeks, and obviously you're taking Kittle and Andrews for sure over him. But at this point, we've seen that no one's really stepped up on Washington. Curtis Samuel's been hurt. Dimey Brown's been hurt. DeAndre Carter is like their desperation number 2 wide receiver behind Terry McLaurin right now. So I do think that Thomas, who is expected to be back this week, is going to step into a high volume role rest of season. And again, he's a guy you can get for a second. You can get for guys like Gabriel Davis, Jacoby Myers, if you need tight end help. I mean, this is how cheap Logan Thomas still is right now.
See, when he went down in Smash Except 2, the one guy really wanted Carson Wentz. I got a first-round pick, which looks like kind of in the middle, and Logan Thomas has an add-on, and I feel like the window's closed to get him in as an add-on. But, I mean, if you can get him for a second-round pick, he's been a locked and loaded tight end 1. I mean, you gotta go in that area. Are there some deeper guys? I'm starting to look into some leagues where that tight end is one of the last positions I add. And are there some guys out there right now that you can have on the cheap end that people aren't really looking at?
Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, we talked about Tyler Conklin. He was a guy that I picked up for free in the preseason on a lot of leagues. Dan Arnold is the more recent breakout because, outside of that first game with the Jaguars, which was just like a day or two after he got traded to the team, he's averaged a 66% snap share in the 4 games since. And over that span, he's seen 7.5 targets per game, 5 catches for 55 yards per game. I mean, that's good enough for tight end 14 in points per game on the season, which isn't elite by any means, but that's very serviceable production if you're loaded at the rest of your spots. Again, week 15, Houston, 4th in fantasy points allowed to tight ends. Week 16, we talked about how bad the Jets are against tight ends. And then a tough matchup in week 17 against New England. But again, that's really on paper. They haven't faced any teams with really pass-catching tight ends outside of Dallas. And in that game, the Patriots gave up 5 catches for 79 yards to Dalton Schultz and a touchdown to Blake Jarwin in the same game. So, again, a great fantasy matchup or fantasy playoff matchups for Dan Arnold. And he's a guy that you can get for a 3rd-round pick.
Yeah, and Dan Arnold has been very good. Speaking of which, the Dan Arnold of the fantasy community has joined us here. What is up? John
What's
is
up,
in.
Boys? What's good?
I just felt like that was the perfect segue there. But how you doing?
Oh, doing great. Good to be here. Showing up a little late, fashionably late. Showing up in style. Just kind of came in backstage, like big entrance music.
I saw you walking up Conor McGregor style.
Oh,
so
yeah.
We're on to the tight ends right now, and we were talking about Dan Arnold is a deeper stash. We've talked about Tyler Conklin. We've talked about Logan Thomas. Being on the cheap end, Zach Ertz. Are there any tight ends where you saw Freiermuth break out this past week? Cole Kmet had a nice week. Are there some guys that are flying a little bit under the radar? Guys that just aren't getting the love that they deserve that you're going out there and buying?
Yeah, for sure. I was going to mention Pat Freiermuth. He's actually really shown what he can do when he's gotten the target share in Pittsburgh with Ebron out. The last couple of weeks, he's getting a ton of red zone looks from Big Ben. And remember, this guy actually has some of the draft pedigree, the athleticism, and he seems to be always on the field. So this is one I really like because you could still kind of get him for sneaky value in a team where you're competing, but certainly in rebuild. He's a great guy to build around. So that one I like a whole lot right now. There's even still some leagues where, in a rebuild, maybe go reach out and pick up Herb Smith if you can. Someone like that just completely off everyone's radar. Some guy that's trying to make some moves and compete. Like, all right, well, throw in Herb Smith for me, and we can get the deal done. That's another one I might recommend you look at.
I like it. Let's move over to the wide receiver position, right? I mean, this is one where who are those guys that we've got to go out and buy, right? I mean, Cooper Kupp's almost become unobtainable because of the type of season he's had. This felt like a dirty move, but I traded Robert Woods in a late 23 first for Cooper Kupp, and I don't regret it. And I know that seems a little bit on the crazy side when you thought it was 1A, 1B, but it certainly isn't. I mean, Cooper Kupp is just absolutely dominating. And because of the age, some people are not quite catching up on the value of what he's been putting up. I mean, this was one of his worst games, 11 for 95 and 20 fantasy points. I mean, he is a lock for 20 fantasy points almost every single week. Ceiling of, he's had 5 games over 30. I mean, that's insane for value for a guy like that. I mean, what are we willing to give up on a contending team to get Cooper Kupp? Is 2 firsts crazy? You know, I mean, is that kind of the ceiling there? What are we trying to do?
Not at all. I mean, we talked about, last week or a couple weeks ago, where I prefer Kupp over Devontae Adams at this point. So I think he's still undervalued based on where I value him. So if you can get him for 2 firsts, then that's definitely a move I consider for a strong contending team.
Yeah, and I mean, when I talked about that Robert Woods deal, I was talking to my brother, and he's like, "No, what sense does that make?" And I'm like, a lot, because I mean, Robert Woods is flying a little bit under the radar. He's had a couple nice weeks here where I feel like, you know, a late first can buy you Robert Woods, and you want as many pieces as possible in that Rams offense, you know. And I think even Van Jefferson has really stepped in there and gotten similar type play to Robert Woods. But Cooper Kupp is a league winner this year. You cannot deny what he's been able to do when he's been out there.
My little Cooper Kupp, that's the sweetest.
See, I was thinking about coming out singing, you know, Red Cooper Kupp, but you know, like we get more like a red.
I like mine. Three Amigos,
yours is better.
Little reference there, but definitely, everyone that has Cooper Kupp does have the sweetest smile on their face because he looks like a league winner. And 2 firsts, that's a smash for me, Dad. It's been hard to pick him up though. I think that everybody's kind of onto it at this point. That move was like a month ago, I think. But for sure, he's just a guy that just appears to be potential wide receiver 1 on the season if he can stay healthy down the stretch here. And Stafford, despite the off week that he just had, looks like even a potential MVP candidate. And he had, I think, a down week with it felt like he had a down week at least. He had 11 receptions for 90-something yards and still just piled up the PPR points. So 2 firsts for sure would be worth it to me, or a piece in a first for sure if you can make that move. Maybe part with a younger wide receiver and a first and pick up a guy that could maybe push you over the edge and win a ship.
The question that I'm getting the most right now is, Dad, what do I do with Calvin Ridley? I think Calvin Ridley is the hardest thing right now in fantasy to try to figure out, you know, because I feel like, you know, I mean, obviously mental health is a big thing, you know, and he stepped away and he's getting some help, and that's great. But we don't know when he's coming back. You know, he's eligible to come back week 13, but we don't know if that's when he's going to come back, you know, and we're looking at a guy who has been fantastic when he's on the field, but I believe he's going to be 27 years old. What kind of moves can we make? You know, someone's offered me Deebo Samuel straight up for him, you know, on a contending team. And I'm like, I feel like I'm giving up some value, but Deebo, you know, with the exception of when Kittle came back, is a different type story, but it's only 1 week. But I mean, what are we doing with Calvin Ridley? If you're on a contender, you know, you were banking on him being your wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2. We got to move off him, right? We got to make some kind of move here. If you're in that win now mode, what are we doing?
Yeah, I think that, look, I mean, there's enough uncertainty in the situation where if you are contending and you had Calvin Ridley, you got to try and move him. Maybe you take a little loss, but this is a situation where you got to, I mean, and we got Mr. Risk Averse Mong over here, who's I think probably going to agree with this. There is a lot of risk that the guy just doesn't come back, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously the worst case scenario. And so the value you could just kind of see continuing to decline over time. If another news story pops, this guy ain't coming back this season, you just lost a lot more value. So it really depends on, of course, every team. But if you're continuing to your point, you got to be shopping and see what you can get. If I could get Debo for Calvin Ridley, smash for me.
I was trying to get a little plus. The guys that, people that have asking me, I've been saying, try to get Mike Evans, try to get Keenan Allen, try to get,
There you go.
Adam Thielen plus. Some people aren't totally on the Michael Pittman train. Get a guy like that. It's so hard. I mean, I feel like we might lose a little bit of value, but it's kind of, like John said, Mung, you're a little bit less risk averse. I mean, what's the bottom line here we're taking for Calvin Ridley? What's that guy where you're like, okay, that's the lowest I would go?
Yeah, it's just very tough right now, right? Because Calvin Ridley is a player whose value is, there's a wide range of how people value him right now because of the uncertainty. But I've still seen trades where someone got Amari Cooper straight up for him.
That was another one, yeah.
That's a deal I would take in a heartbeat, especially if I'm contending. I saw somebody get Mike Williams straight up for Ridley. So these deals are still available out there. I saw somebody get Jalen Waddle straight up for Calvin Ridley. And these are all deals that I would make, especially as a contender. And you're right. At this point, you're probably selling him for 60, 70 cents on the dollar. I saw a deal that was Calvin Ridley plus a first for George Kittle. So, certainly losing a little value there. You are getting Keenan Allen straight up in some leagues. Mm-hmm. But again, I think the longer you wait, the less that you're going to be able to get for him. So you have to make that decision soon. Can I potentially contend without him? And two, do I need the wins now, or can I afford to potentially wait until week 13 and hope he comes back, right? If you're 7-2 right now and you have 3 or 4 strong wide receiver options, then maybe you can wait until right before the fantasy trade deadline and hold and hope that he comes back. But for teams who might not be, or who might be 6-3 with players on bye this week, or 5-4, and you think that you are a contender, but you need wins now, then yeah, I think you do need to take a little bit of a loss on Ridley and try to get something usable for him for the foreseeable future.
That's great analysis. I love that. I mean,
good advice.
It's a very difficult situation indeed. Another guy that's in a difficult situation, we talked about him a little bit before. If you bought Mike Williams early, you were thrilled. At this point, he is banged up. That knee is not right, and we're looking at 2 receptions in each of his last 3 games. This was his best week out of those 3 with 58 yards. He just doesn't look the same. He's zapped, some of that explosiveness. What are we doing there? Mike Williams, this is a knee injury that, he's been banged up his entire career. Can we get, would you give up Mike Williams to get Adam Thielen for a stretch run? Would you give up, and try to get one of these veterans? I get a lot of questions of like, hey, what's going on, man? We're looking at 3 or 4 straight games here where Mike Williams I'm putting him out there as my wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, and he's putting up duds. What are we doing with him?
Yeah, it really kind of depends on your team makeup, right? Because, I kind of like having some big boom guys on my team where, on any given week, they could just completely blow the top. But if you really need consistent production right now out of a guy and you're in tight matchups every week, Mike Williams could actually cost you a couple weeks. So it does kind of depend on how you have really constructed your team. I do see some risk. I mean, early on in the season, he was stringing together a lot of boom weeks in a row, but now we've seen him kind of fall off again. I think the defenses are kind of onto that a little bit and making their adjustments. Typically after roughly 5, 6, 7 games, there's enough film out there where people start to realize, all right, we got to rotate more coverage over to Mike Williams. He was still actually getting a lot of red zone targets and still getting a lot of love. It just wasn't necessarily connecting. So if you could get somebody like more than a Thielen, to your point, or someone like that gives you more consistent production, you may want to consider it. And he does have that injury history. So we're the concern, again, just on the risk averse side, is that something else happens to this guy. And again, value's gone at that point.
Anything to add to that, Mung?
Yeah, I'm on the complete opposite. I would aggressively buy Mike Williams right now. From what I've seen, the reports, the knee is okay now. But he's matched up against J.C. Jackson 2 weeks ago, and then against Darius Slay last week. But now he gets Minnesota, Pittsburgh coming up. I think he gets back to maybe not quite the top 5 numbers we were seeing in the first few weeks, because that was somewhat touchdown dependent. But I think he's a strong wide receiver 2 option rest of season still. And, people are understandably nervous after 3 down games in a row, first due to the injury and then 2 very tough matchups. But I have faith from what I've heard, the knee injury is no longer an issue. So yes, he has had injury issues in the past, but again, midway through the season, right? This is the time to roll the dice, and I do like rolling the dice on Williams.
I love it. We were talking about depth and trying to build a little bit of depth here because of injuries, because of COVID. I made 4 trades this week that I got this guy thrown in, and Mung, I know you love this guy. I got him thrown in on every deal. Just like, hey, just throw him in. He's not going to help your team. And that's Cole Beasley. Cole Beasley is that depth wide receiver that you can throw in there and feel comfortable. I mean, he's got week 6, 21 points on 9 targets. Week 8, 21 points on 13 targets. Week 9, 11 points on 11 targets. Cole Beasley is that non-sexy name, along with Hunter Renfrow, that if you can get those guys added into deals right now, you can buy them for 3rd-round picks. Those are the guys that when all of a sudden they say, hey, DeAndre Hopkins isn't playing this week, you're like, okay, I can plug this guy in and I don't feel bad about it, right? Both of them are guys that are respectively top 30 wide receivers at this point, and go out there and just get it done. I mean, Hunter Renfrow, he's had every single game this year except for week 6, he's been above 10 points. And when you have that situation where you need a depth wide receiver, you want them to get at least 10 points. And he goes out there, 5, 6 catches every single game and goes out there and gets it done. Any guys like that for you? I mean, I know, Mung, those are 2 of the guys that you totally agree with that we talked about. But are there any of those other guys out there where it's like, dude, get that guy as a depth move? I mean, yeah, you're not going to be able to buy some of these big name wide receivers. You're not going to be able to buy A.J. Brown, DK Metcalf. But if you got a 3rd floating around and you can buy Cole Beasley, or 3rd and a toss in, go do it.
Yeah, and I mean, Beasley and Renfrow, they're just seeing a ton of target volume. Renfrow, obviously, too, with Ruggs now gone. These are guys who are outscoring bigger name wide receivers like Cortland Sutton and T. Higgins and Laviska Shenault in points per game. I mean, if you can, honestly, I understand that I was never on the Shenault train. So I have a question for you guys. Would you trade Laviska Shenault for Renfrow or Beasley on a contending team?
Well, that's painful. Go ahead, Jed.
I would.
You would do it?
What we say?
I know
Beasley,
you would.
Would you give me Beasley in a 3rd? If you say yes, I would do it. I know I'm always trying to get that extra 3rd. It's the Riley Bymaster principle. I mean, Laviska Shenault's putting up like 4 points most weeks. I mean, that's scary, So it's like, I might do it. I know that sounds crazy, and I know most people that love Laviska Shenault would just flip out, but can I maybe get both of them?
Yeah, but I mean, they're just guys who are producing. Again, the unsexy names, right? How many years in a row could you get Julian Edelman for a couple 3rds, right? And, a couple other under-the-radar names who've just been consistently producing. Tim Patrick, he's one. Yeah. We've seen that opposing cornerbacks, the number 1 guys, are matching up on Cortland Sutton, which is forcing Teddy Bridgewater to go elsewhere. And number 2, this is a newer guy who is going to be definitely more boom or bust. But with Odell Beckham released, I mean, Donovan Peoples-Jones he becomes that Van Jefferson type deep threat, right? Where he's probably going to get you 0 points a couple weeks. And then when you need it, if you're playing the matchups, he might get you 20.
John, that's bringing back memories of you down with DPP, but it's DPJ, Donovan Peoples-Jones. Go out and get him.
Yeah, I do like that one. Yeah, he's a big play threat as well now, and they desperately need that, especially with Beckham leaving and heading to Green Bay. I'm sorry, that hasn't been announced quite yet. By the way, I like the Van Jefferson one. I was going to throw in someone like Christian Kirk as well.
He's just wide receiver 24 right now, and he threw a beautiful deep ball. Yeah. That play was that was actually designed for AJ Green and DeAndre Hopkins to do the little flip around. And I heard him on NFL Today. He was like, "Hey, I got my shot." That was a beautiful pass, man. Should have been a touchdown.
Right, and I was going to throw another one in for rebuilds. I mean, not maybe as cheap to your point, but Jalen Waddle. I mean, he's just. I think it's Jamar Chase has just kind of stolen the show, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, Jalen Waddle is getting a ton of targets in Miami, and if we can just get Tua in there and stay healthy for a little bit, I really like that. They're often playing from behind, and the kid is a superstar. Athleticism, big play. He's kind of lining up and getting catches all over the field. So I actually think it is a guy that you could look at paying a little bit more for, maybe. Rebuild and or contender could potentially work with Waddle right now.
Mung, we talked about this earlier, and I like that. We talked about, that you can buy Javonte Williams, and I know you were saying, buy Melvin Gordon on the cheap. You can buy Javonte Williams before he blows up because that schedule's so good and just juicy. The Jets schedule, they have the number one wide receiver schedule the rest of the season. I mean, it is, since Mike White's come on, we saw what actually happened this past week. Is this our last chance to buy Elijah Moore? I mean, should we be throwing out cheap offers for Corey Davis? You don't want a bunch of Jets on your roster, but I mean, Mike White has looked serviceable. He's gone out there. He's put up a ton of yards, and we saw Elijah Moore was the wide receiver 1 overall this past week. Can we still buy him and say this is our last window here because he looked really good?
Honestly, probably not, because I think a lot of people who already have Elijah Moore still remember the preseason hype, right? And we know that he started slow this year, but people were on him, so it's not like he's coming out of nowhere. So I think he's still going to cost you a first, and I don't necessarily expect consistent production the rest of the way. So he's not someone that I'm actively looking to target for contending teams, at least. Certainly, I like the talent, but just not someone I would aggressively trade for or overpay for necessarily for his rest of season production.
Respect that for sure. Are there any other guys that we just haven't hit on, whether it's quarterbacks? We didn't really talk a lot about the quarterbacks. A guy who you can buy, let's say you traded your first round pick and all you have left is a second and some, some upside guys. Who are some quarterbacks that we could possibly throw out there, that we could pick up that would still keep us in contention?
Yeah, I mean, one name that comes to mind is Daniel Jones. He's another guy who we know he can run. He's actually 5th in rushing yards right now among quarterbacks, behind only Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, and Justin Fields. He's getting Saquon Barkley back after the bye. Could get a close to 100% health Kenny Galladay and Kadarius Toney. Sterling Shepard is expected back by the fantasy playoffs. So he's a quarterback who both can run and is getting a lot of yards after the catch, weapons back. So someone whose stock is definitely on the rise, but leaves a bad taste in the mouth of a lot of fantasy GMs because of his lack of production the last few weeks. So potentially a cheap buy option rest of season.
I like that one. I was going to maybe see if the recent injury to Tua might provide a little bit of discount. I mean, I think that it's certainly the rest of the season. I personally think that Tua is still going to be the guy next year. He needs to just stay on the field. So Tua is one that I'd look at, and then maybe someone like Carson Wentz as well.
Yes, I was just about to say that.
Okay, yeah.
QB 10 right now, man.
Yeah, really. I mean, and he's now finally has a connection with Pittman, to your point earlier. He's moving the ball around. He's occasionally getting some high value rushes in right near the red zone himself, calling his own number. So, yeah, that's kind of an interesting one too. There's some guys like perennially underrated, like Kirk Cousins and Derek Carr, but
you came right on just to take both my guys, all three of my guys. Man. I think all three of those take a first round pick to get them.
Yeah, they do.
But I
That's
mean,
what I was about to say. Yeah.
Mung and I were talking about how James Conner perennially just doesn't carry the value of what he can put up on the field. Kirk Cousins is the QB 11, and you could still buy him for a first round pick. And I bought him for Trey Sermon in a second 2 weeks ago, and I'm loving it because I didn't have a QB 2, and I think Derek Carr, that window's in there. I mean, the window on Tannehill should have closed up because he's playing pretty well, but it's an exciting time. And if you guys got questions when it comes to, contending, send us those questions. Obviously you can do it for rebuilding too. We're going to talk about that a little bit next week. But if you guys want to know, hey, is this, you don't want to leverage the farm where it's like, we're done. I offered up 5 guys, not the burger, but I offered up 5 guys and, now I'm done. I've totally ruined my team. You know, we want to make sure we're giving you guys the best advice. So hit us up. You know, you can find all of us on Twitter. Why don't you guys take us away? Mung, what do you got working on? And, you know, obviously some exciting news.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to as many Twitter questions as I can every week, especially Sunday mornings. You can find me on Twitter at FFA_Mung. That's MENG. And you guys know what quarterback won't cost you a first-round rookie pick in Superflex that we talked about last year, who's making a potentially triumphant return, is Taysom Hill, the man himself. Pretty much the discount Taylor Heineke right now. So just throwing that last name out there before we sign off for the Knights. John?
Yeah, hey, good to be back here. You can find me atop the Smash Accept Listener League standings, first place.
We're tied, but you got me in points, man. Yo,
by a pretty considerable.
I know, it's bad. It's bad. Derrick Henry, what? No.
yeah, I know. It's going to be an interesting finish. You can also find me at Dynasty_trades, and love mixing it up with you all this time of year as things are starting to heat up towards the playoffs. Definitely we'll try to get back on the pod with Dad and Mung here. So, yeah, back over to you, Dad.
Yeah, thanks again for tuning in, guys. I also want to formally apologize. I have not been as active on Twitter. Life is absolutely crazy this time of year, and I appreciate you guys. You know, if you guys hit me up on DMs, I'm answering every time. I've missed a couple, and I apologize for that. But thanks again for tuning in, and enjoy